The flames that devoured Mercy Hartwell's cabin on that October night of 1887 would forever divide her life into two halves. Before she learned what it meant to be carried by a man who had no reason to save her, and after, the fire started at midnight, creeping through the dry timber like a whispered secret. Mercy woke to the smell of smoke threading through her dreams, pulling her from sleep with the gentleness of a lover's touch before revealing its true nature. By the time she stumbled from her narrow bed, orange tongues already licked at the kitchen window, and the cabin, her late husband's final gift and her only shelter in this godforsaken stretch of Wyoming territory, had become a furnace. She pressed her back against the bedroom wall, nightgown clinging to her skin, and felt the heat push through the thin planks like an animal trying to break free. The front door lay beyond a curtain of flame. The windows, too small for a woman to squeeze through, mocked her with their promise of cold night air. This was how she would die, then. Alone, as she had lived these past 3 years since consumption claimed Thomas. The irony wasn't lost on her. She who had survived the brutal winter of '85, the summer drought that killed her vegetable garden, and the loneliness that gnawed at her bones like a persistent ache. Fire would finish what the frontier had started, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. The sound came first, hoofbeats pounding hard earth, coming fast. Then a man's voice, deep and commanding, cutting through the roar of flames. "Ma'am, ma'am, can you hear me?" Mercy pressed her face to the bedroom window, squinting through smoke and heat shimmer. A figure on horseback circled the cabin, and, even through the distortion of flame and terror, she could make out the quality of his mount, the fine cut of his clothes. This was no drifter or ranch hand. This was money, the kind that rode through her valley but never stopped, never acknowledged the widow who scratched out her living selling eggs and mending torn shirts. "I'm here," she called, her voice barely carrying over the fire's hungry roar. "I'm trapped." The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the ground with purpose. Through the window, she watched him circle the cabin like a predator studying prey, calculating angles and possibilities. He shed his coat, expensive wool, she noted with the eye of a woman who had darned 1,000 cheaper garments, and wrapped it around his arm. "Stand back from the door," he shouted. Mercy pressed herself against the far wall just as the bedroom door exploded inward. Smoke poured through the opening, and behind it came the stranger, moving through the flames as if they were merely inconvenient curtains to be brushed aside. The fire had claimed his hat and singed his dark hair, but his eyes, pale blue, like winter sky, remained steady, focused entirely on her. "Come on," he said, extending his hand. No introduction, no explanation, just absolute certainty that she would trust him. She hesitated for a heartbeat. 3 years of solitude had taught her caution, and this man, tall, broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed, represented everything she had learned to distrust. Wealth, power, the kind of man who took what he wanted and rode away without looking back. But the flames were climbing the walls now, and choice had become a luxury she couldn't afford. She took his hand. His grip was strong, calloused despite his obvious prosperity, and warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire surrounding them. He pulled her against his chest, wrapping her in the circle of his arms, and she caught a scent that shouldn't exist in this hell. Leather and cedar, clean and masculine and completely at odds with the destruction around them. "Hold tight," he murmured against her ear, and then they were moving. The journey through the burning cabin lasted forever and no time at all. She felt the heat press against her back, heard timbers groan and crack overhead, sensed the very air around them turning to flame. But stronger than all of that was the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against her cheek, the sure way he navigated the chaos. As if he had walked through fire before and found it wanting, they burst through the front door in a shower of sparks and collapsed onto the hard ground 20 feet from the cabin. Behind them, the roof caved in with a sound like the world ending, sending a column of sparks spiraling into the star-scattered sky. For a moment, they lay there in the dirt, breathing hard, watching 3 years of her life turn to ash in memory. Then the stranger pushed himself up on his elbows and looked down at her with those winter sky eyes. "You hurt?" he asked, his voice rougher now, scraped raw by smoke. She shook her head, though she could feel burns on her arms where flying embers had found their mark. I'm, I'm alive. Yes, he said simply. You are. Something in his tone made her look closer at his face. The firelight revealed aristocratic features marked by recent grief, the kind of loss that carved itself into a man's bones and changed the way he moved through the world. This wasn't just a good Samaritan who happened to be riding past. This was a man who knew something about salvation, about last chances, and the weight of carrying someone else's life in your hands. "I'm Mercy," she said, because it seemed important. Suddenly, that he know her name. "Tobias," he replied. "Tobias Blackwood." She knew that name. Everyone in the territory knew it. Blackwood Ranch sprawled across 10,000 acres of prime grazing land, and the man who owned it was said to be richer than some Eastern Railroad barons. But knowing his name only deepened the mystery. What was Tobias Blackwood doing riding past her cabin at midnight? His ranch lay 15 miles north, accessible by a dozen better roads than the rough track that led to her door. "Why were you here?" she asked, pushing herself up to sitting. The question came out more blunt than she intended, but the night had burned away her patience for social niceties. His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I couldn't sleep. Sometimes I ride when the house gets too quiet." There was pain in those words, carefully controlled but unmistakable. She recognized it because she knew that particular brand of insomnia, the kind that came from sleeping alone in a bed meant for two, from eating at a table set for one, from the terrible weight of silence where conversation used to live. "Your wife?" she asked gently. "6 months ago." He stood and brushed ash from his expensive trousers, the motion sharp and final. "Fever took her." The words hung between them like smoke. Mercy felt something shift in her chest, a recognition, a kinship she hadn't expected. They were both members of the same unwelcome club, survivors of a love that death had ended too soon. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. He nodded once, then turned his attention to the dying fire. "We need to talk about what happens now." "What do you mean?" "You can't stay here. There's nothing left." He gestured to the smoldering ruins. "You'll need somewhere to go until you can make other arrangements." The practical reality of her situation hit her like a physical blow. She owned nothing now but the nightgown on her back and the bitter taste of smoke in her mouth. No home, no possessions, no savings tucked away for disasters. She had spent every penny just surviving winter to winter. "I have a sister in Denver," she said, though the words felt hollow. Victoria had made it clear in her last letter that Mercy's welcome had limits, especially now that Victoria's husband was struggling with his own business concerns. "Denver's a long way off," Tobias said quietly, "and winter's coming on fast." As if summoned by his words, a cold wind swept across the valley, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. October in Wyoming territory was nature's way of reminding folks that comfort was temporary, that the mountains held winter in their fists like a weapon waiting to be unleashed. "I'll manage," she said, though she had no idea how. Tobias studied her face in the flickering light of the dying fire. "You're proud. I'm practical. Same thing out here." He walked to his horse, a magnificent black stallion that stood patient despite the smoke and chaos. From his saddlebags, he withdrew a blanket and returned to wrap it around her shoulders. The wool was soft, expensive, and carried his scent, that mixture of leather and cedar that had comforted her through the flames. "I have a proposition," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Something in his voice made her look up sharply. "What kind of proposition?" But before he could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through the night air. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, silhouetted against the dying fire, and something about the way Tobias tensed, the way his hand dropped instinctively to the gun at his hip, told her this night was far from over. "Tobias," one of the riders called out, his voice carrying a note of false joviality that made Mercy's skin crawl. "Fancy meeting you here." "Garrett," Tobias replied, his voice flat as winter ground. "What brings you out so late?" The rider named Garrett urged his horse closer, and the firelight revealed a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruel set of his mouth and the calculating gleam in his dark eyes. "Could ask you the same question, cousin, though I reckon I can guess." Mercy felt the tension crackle between the two men like electricity before a storm. and she realized she had stumbled into something much more dangerous than a simple cabin fire. Garrett Blackwood had the same pale blue eyes as his cousin, but where Tobias's gaze held depth and shadow, Garrett's was all surface, sharp as broken glass and twice as cutting. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man who had never met a problem he couldn't buy, bully, or burn his way through. Mighty convenient, you being here just when the widow's place caught fire, Garrett said, his smile never reaching his eyes, almost like you knew it was going to happen. Tobias stepped forward, placing himself between Mercy and the mounted men. What are you suggesting, Garrett? Not suggesting anything, cousin. Just observing. Garrett's gaze slid to Mercy, and she felt the need to pull the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Though I got to say, it's curious timing. What with the railroad survey coming through next month and all. The words hit Mercy like a physical blow. Railroad survey? No one had mentioned any railroad to her. She had owned, a small plot of land, barely enough to sustain herself. But if the railroad was coming through, you didn't tell her, Garrett said, reading her expression with predatory satisfaction. Well, ain't that interesting? Mrs. Hartwell, did you know your little homestead sits right in the path of the proposed Western Pacific route? That worthless patch of dirt you've been scraping by on is about to become some of the most valuable land in the territory. Mercy's mind reeled. Valuable land? Her homestead had been nothing but hardship and heartbreak. Poor soil, difficult water, isolated from town. Thomas had claimed it because it was all they could afford, and she had stayed because she had nowhere else to go. The railroad's still just talk, Tobias said quietly, but his voice carried a warning. Oh, it's more than talk now, Garrett replied, producing a folded document from his coat. Got the official survey papers right here. Seems the company's been buying up land along the route, paying top dollar for willing sellers. His smile turned predatory, and finding other ways to convince the unwilling ones. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Mercy looked at the smoldering ruins of her cabin, then at Garrett's satisfied expression, and understanding hit her like a fist to the stomach. You, she whispered, you burned down my home. Now, that's a serious accusation, Garrett said, but his tone was amused, rather than offended. Can't prove a thing like that. Cabins catch fire all the time out here. Accidents happen. You son of a… Tobias started forward, his hand moving to his gun. Careful, cousin. Garrett's voice hardened, and his two companions shifted in their saddles, hands resting on their own weapons. Wouldn't want there to be any more accidents tonight. Mercy felt the danger crackling between the men like lightning before a storm. She had lived on the frontier long enough to recognize the moment when words gave way to violence, and she knew that whatever happened next would likely end with someone dead in the dirt. Wait, she said, stepping forward despite Tobias's protective gesture. What do you want? Garrett's smile returned, cold and calculating. Simple. You sign over your land rights to me, and I'll make sure you're compensated fairly for your loss. More than fairly, actually. I'm prepared to offer you $500 for your claim. $500. It was more money than Mercy had seen in her entire life, enough to start fresh somewhere else, maybe even buy a small house in Denver near her sister. But looking at Garrett's face, she knew there was a catch. And if I refuse, well, that would be unfortunate. Garrett's gaze swept over the burning ruins. Seems like you're having a run of bad luck already. Hate to see it continue. The threat was clear, and Mercy felt something cold settle in her stomach. She was trapped between two impossible choices: sign away her land to the man who had destroyed her home, or refuse and face whatever other accidents he might arrange. The lady needs time to think, Tobias said, his voice steady despite the tension radiating from his frame. Time's a luxury she can't afford, Garrett replied. Railroad company wants this settled before winter. They're planning to break ground come spring. Then they can wait one more night, Tobias said. She just lost everything. She deserves that much. Garrett studied his cousin for a long moment, and Mercy caught something in his expression, a flicker of old resentment, family grievances that ran deeper than tonight's conflict. You always were too soft, Tobias. Just like your father. The words carried the weight of old wounds. Cost him everything in the end, didn't it? Tobias went very still, and Mercy felt the temperature drop another 10 degrees. Leave my father out of this. Hard to do, seeing as how his softness cost our family half the ranch. Garrett leaned forward in his saddle. But I suppose you learned from his mistakes. After all, you didn't let sentiment stop you from marrying Helen for her. Father's water rights. The words hit like a physical blow. Mercy saw Tobias flinch, saw the guilt and pain flash across his features before he could hide it. She remembered his earlier words about his wife's death, the careful way he had spoken of grief, and suddenly understood. His marriage hadn't been a love match. It had been a business arrangement. That's enough, Tobias said quietly, but his voice carried the promise of violence. Is it? Garrett's smile widened. I'm just wondering if the widow here knows what kind of man she's trusting. The kind who marries for money and land, who puts business before everything else. Just like his daddy before him. Mercy felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. She had thought she recognized something in Tobias, a kindred spirit, another soul wounded by loss. But what if she had been wrong? What if his rescue had been motivated by something other than simple decency? Mrs. Hartwell, Garrett continued, his voice taking on a false note of concern, you might want to ask yourself why my cousin here was riding past your cabin at midnight. Mighty convenient timing, wouldn't you say? The seed of doubt, once planted, grew quickly. Mercy looked at Tobias, searching his face for answers, but he was staring at Garrett with an expression that could have melted steel. You think I had something to do with the fire? Tobias asked, his voice dangerously quiet. I think you've got a talent for being in the right place at the right time, Garrett replied. And I think you've got your eye on the same prize I do. What prize? Mercy asked, though she was afraid she already knew. The railroad contract, Garrett said. See, Mrs. Hartwell, the Western Pacific isn't just looking for land. They're looking for a local partner, someone with the resources and connections to help them navigate territorial politics. Someone with money and influence. He gestured to Tobias. Someone like my cousin here. Or someone like me. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The railroad would make someone very rich. Whoever controlled the land deals, the supply contracts, the political connections. And both Blackwood cousins were positioning themselves to be that someone. So, you see, Garrett continued, Tobias here has just as much reason to want your land as I do. The only difference is, he's got a more romantic way of going about it. Mercy felt sick. She looked at Tobias, hoping to see denial in his eyes, but instead saw something worse, resignation. He wasn't denying it. Is it true? She asked quietly. Tobias was silent for a long moment, and in that silence, Mercy felt something fragile break inside her chest. She had been such a fool, thinking that a man like him could have purely altruistic motives for saving her. It's complicated, he said finally. No, she replied, backing away from him. It's simple. You want my land, just like he does. The only difference is your methods. Mercy, Mrs. Hartwell, she corrected sharply. I think we're past first names, don't you? Garrett laughed, a sound like breaking glass. There's that frontier pragmatism I've heard so much about. You're smarter than you look, widow. Smart enough to know when I'm being played, Mercy said, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. By both of you. She turned back to Tobias, and for a moment, she saw something raw and desperate in his eyes. But it was too late. The trust between them, fragile as new ice, had shattered. I need to think, she said. Alone. Of course, Garrett said, touching the brim of his hat in a mockery of courtesy. But don't take too long. Winter's coming, and a woman alone out here. He shrugged. Well, accidents happen, as you've seen. With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode off into the darkness, his companions following. The sound of their hoofbeats faded into the night, leaving Mercy alone with Tobias and the smoking ruins of her life. It's not what you think, Tobias said after a long moment. Isn't it? Mercy pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. You married for money and land. Your cousin says you're after the railroad contract. And you just happened to be riding past my cabin at midnight, just in time to play the hero. I saved your life. Did you? Or did you just save your investment? The words hung between them like a chasm. Tobias stepped toward her, and she saw something break in his expression. You're right, he said quietly. I didn't know about the railroad. I didn't know your land was valuable. And yes, I was riding past your cabin because I've been watching it, trying to figure out how to approach you about selling. The admission hit her like a physical blow, even though she had been expecting it. But I didn't set the fire, he continued. And I didn't save you because of the land. I saved you because… He stopped, running a hand through his singed hair. Because I couldn't let you die? Not when I had the power to prevent it. Pretty words, Mercy said, but her voice lacked conviction. They're true words. His eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her breath catch. I may have married Helen for her father's water rights, but I grew to love her. And when she died, I thought I was done with feeling anything for anyone. But tonight, carrying you out of that fire… He shook his head. I can't explain it. But it wasn't about the land. Mercy wanted to believe him. God help her. She wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. But 3 years of surviving on her own had taught her that wanting something didn't make it true. Even if that's so, she said, it doesn't change the facts. You want my land. Garrett wants my land. And I'm caught in the middle. Then don't be. Tobias stepped closer, and she caught that scent again, leather and cedar and something indefinably male. Come with me. Tonight. Let me take you somewhere safe while we figure this out. Your ranch. The idea was both terrifying and tempting. My ranch. You'll have your own room, your own space. No obligations, no strings attached. Just safety. It was a reasonable offer. The smart thing to do. But as Mercy looked at the ruins of her cabin, she felt something harden inside her chest. She had spent 3 years being practical, being careful, being afraid. And where had it gotten her? I need time to think, she said. Mercy, time, she repeated firmly. And space. I'll give you an answer in the morning. Tobias nodded reluctantly. Where will you go tonight? She hadn't thought that far ahead. The night was cold, and she had nothing but the blanket on her shoulders and the nightgown on her back. But pride, that stubborn frontier pride, made her lift her chin. I'll manage. The hell you will. His voice was rough with frustration. It's October in Wyoming. You'll freeze before dawn. That's my choice to make. They stared at each other across the smoking ruins, two stubborn people caught in a web of desire and distrust. Finally, Tobias sighed. There's a line shack about a mile north of here. It's got a fireplace and some basic supplies. You can shelter there for the night. And you? I'll camp out here. Make sure Garrett doesn't come back. It was a reasonable compromise, and Mercy found herself nodding. Oh, right. Tobias walked to his horse and returned with a bundle of clothes. These belong to one of my ranch hands. They'll be big on you, but they're clean and warm. Mercy accepted the bundle, her fingers brushing his as she took it. The contact sent a jolt through her, awareness, attraction, something dangerous and unwanted. Thank you, she said quietly. Don't thank me yet, he replied. Wait until you see what tomorrow brings. As if summoned by his words, a wolf howled in the distance, a long, lonely sound that seemed to echo from the mountains themselves. And somewhere in that howl, Mercy heard the promise of harder choices to come. The line shack squatted against the Wyoming darkness like a forgotten prayer, its weathered boards silver in the moonlight. Mercy pushed through the door, grateful for the shelter but acutely aware of how alone she was, miles from town, with nothing but the clothes Tobias had given her and the terrible weight of the choice ahead. Inside, the shack was sparse but functional. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and someone had left a supply of split wood beside it. A narrow bunk stretched along the opposite wall, covered with a wool blanket that smelled of horses and honest sweat. It was a working man's refuge, simple and clean. She changed into the borrowed clothes, rough denim pants that she had to roll up at the ankles, a flannel shirt that hung loose on her frame, and a leather vest that still carried the warmth of its previous owner. The transformation felt symbolic somehow, as if she were shedding the helpless widow along with her nightgown, that a fire crackled to life under her practiced hands, and she settled onto the bunk to think. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Tobias walking through the flames, felt his strong arms around her, remembered the moment when she had thought, fool that she was, that she might have found something precious in this harsh land. But that was before she learned about the railroad. Before she understood that her rescue had been as calculated as everything else in his life. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the sounds of night hunters and the memory of Garrett's cold smile. When dawn finally crept through the single window, she felt as though she had aged a decade in one night. She was boiling coffee over the fire when she heard the hoofbeats approaching. Through the window, she saw Tobias riding toward the shack, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. He looked as though he hadn't slept either. His clothes were rumpled, his hair disheveled, and there was a grimness to his expression that hadn't been there the night before. "Mercy," he called out, dismounting near the door. "May I come in?" She almost said no, almost told him to state his business and ride away. But something in his voice, a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before, made her step aside. "Coffee's hot," she said, gesturing to the pot. "Much obliged." He poured himself a cup and stood awkwardly by the fire, as if unsure of his welcome. The easy confidence from the night before had vanished, replaced by something more human and therefore more dangerous. "I brought supplies," he said after a moment. "Food, clothes that might fit you better, some coin to tide you over while you decide what to do." Guilty conscience. The words came out sharper than she intended. "Maybe." He met her eyes. "I did a lot of thinking last night. About what Garrett said, about what you must think of me. And what conclusion did you reach? That I've made a mess. Of things." He set down his cup and ran a hand through his hair. "I told myself I was being practical, watching your place, trying to figure out how to approach you about the railroad. But the truth is, I've been watching you for months." The admission hung between them like a confession. Mercy felt her pulse quicken despite herself. "Watching me? You come to town once a month for supplies. You always wear the same blue dress. Always carry the same wicker basket. You're polite to everyone, but you don't really talk to anyone. You buy exactly what you need, nothing more, and you count your coins twice before spending them." The details were so precise, so intimate, that she felt exposed. "Why?" "Because you're—" He stopped, searching for words. "Because you're like me. Alone, but not broken. Careful, but not afraid. There's something about the way you carry yourself, the way you've survived out here on your own. It's remarkable. So you decided to add me to your collection?" "No." The word came out fierce, immediate. "I decided to admire you from a distance and tell myself that was enough. Until the railroad changed everything." "Until the railroad changed everything," he agreed. "Suddenly you weren't just the intriguing widow who sold eggs at the general store. You were sitting on a fortune, and every land speculator in the territory was going to come calling. Including you. Including me." He didn't deny it, and somehow, that honesty hurt more than a lie would have. "But not like Garrett. Never like Garrett. What's the difference? You both want the same thing." "The difference," he said quietly, "is that I would have asked. I would have explained the situation, made you a fair offer, and accepted your answer. Garrett burns down your home and threatens your life." It was a distinction, she had to admit. But was it enough? "You said you had a proposition last night," she said, "before your cousin arrived." Tobias nodded, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or desperation. "I did. I do. I'm listening." He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for something difficult. "Marry me." The words hit her like a physical blow. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that wasn't one of them. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, his voice steadier now. "Not for love, not for romance. For protection. For survival." "You're insane." "Am I?" He moved closer, and she caught that scent again. Leather and cedar, and something uniquely him. "Think about it, Mercy. You're alone, vulnerable, with valuable land and no way to protect it. Garrett won't stop with burning down your cabin. He'll escalate until he gets what he wants. And you're different? I'm offering you a partnership. An equal partnership. You keep your land, I keep mine, and together we have the resources to deal with whatever comes next. What about the railroad contract? We split it. 50-50. You'd be rich enough to go anywhere, do anything. Or stay here and build something bigger than either of us could manage alone." It was a reasonable offer. A practical offer. The kind of frontier marriage that made sense when survival trumped sentiment. But the part of her that had loved Thomas, that had believed in the possibility of true partnership, recoiled from the cold calculation of it. "Why?" she asked. "Why not just buy my land outright? It would be simpler." "Because I don't want to own you," he said quietly. "I want to protect you. There's a difference. Is there? Or are you just more subtle than your cousin?" Pain flashed across his features, and she realized she had hit a nerve. "Maybe I deserve that. Maybe I've given you reason to doubt my motives. But I'm not Garrett, Mercy. I'm not my father, either. What happened to your father? He trusted the wrong person. Let sentiment override good sense. Lost half the ranch in a bad deal with a man he considered a friend. Tobias stared into the fire, his voice growing distant. He died thinking he was a failure. I swore I'd never make his mistakes. So you married for money instead of love. I married for necessity. Helen needed a husband to keep her father's creditors at bay. I needed the water rights to keep the ranch viable. It was, he struggled for words. It was a good partnership. We respected each other, cared for each other. But it wasn't what you had with your husband. The acknowledgement surprised her. How do you know what I had with Thomas? Because I've seen you at his grave. Every Sunday after church, you sit by his marker and talk to him like he's still there. You bring him wildflowers in spring, evergreen, branches in winter. That's not obligation, mercy. That's love. She felt tears prick her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. Then you understand why I can't accept your proposal. I understand why you think you can't, he said. But I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to let me stand with you against whatever's coming. And if I say no, then I'll respect your decision. But I won't be able to protect you from Garrett. The threat was implicit but clear. Without Tobias's protection, she would be facing Garrett alone. And Garrett had already shown what he was capable of. This is impossible, she said, more to herself than to him. Most things worth doing are. She walked to the window, staring out at the vast sweep of Wyoming landscape. Somewhere out there, Thomas lay buried under 6 feet of prairie soil. What would he think of this proposal? What would he want her to do? I need more time, she said finally. Time's a luxury we don't have. Garrett will be back, and when he comes, he won't be alone. What do you mean? I mean he's got backing. The railroad company, maybe, or Eastern investors. He's got money and men, and he's not going to let one stubborn widow stand in his way. So you're saying I have no choice. I'm saying you have a choice between 2 kinds of partnership, his or mine. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Mercy felt the walls closing in, the frontier that had always offered her freedom and possibility suddenly seeming like a trap. There's a third option, she said quietly. What's that? I could take Garrett's money and disappear. Start over somewhere else. You could, Tobias agreed. But you won't. How do you know? Because you're not the kind of woman who runs from a fight. And because, he paused, as if weighing his words. Because this is your home. Thomas is buried here. You belong here. He was right, damn him. She had put down roots in this harsh soil, watered them with tears and sweat and stubborn determination. The idea of leaving felt like betrayal, of Thomas, of herself, of the life she had built from nothing. If I agreed, she said slowly, what would you expect from me? Companionship, conversation, someone to share the burden of making decisions. He paused. And maybe, someday, if we're lucky, something more. Something more? Friendship, trust, the kind of partnership that goes beyond business. Not love, she noted. He was too honest, or too scarred, to promise that. But friendship, trust, partnership, those were precious things too. Things she hadn't realized. She was hungry for until he offered them. I need to think, she said. Of course. He moved toward the door, then paused. Mercy, whatever you decide, I want you to know, saving you last night was the most important thing I've ever done. Not because of the land, not because of the railroad, because it was you. With that, he was gone, leaving her alone with the weight of an impossible choice and the echo of words that sounded dangerously like the beginning of love. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising a reckoning as inevitable as winter itself. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke just after noon, turning the sky the color of old pewter and driving sheets of rain against the lined shack's weathered walls. Mercy stood at the window, watching lightning fork across the mountains, and tried to ignore the way her heart jumped every time thunder rolled across the valley. She had been alone for 3 hours, wrestling with Tobias's proposal and finding no peace in any direction her thoughts turned. Marriage to a man she barely knew. Partnership with someone who had already admitted to calculating motives. Protection that came with a price she wasn't sure she could pay. But the alternative, facing Garrett alone, seemed impossible. The sound of approaching horses cut through the storm's fury, and Mercy's blood turned to ice when she counted not 3 riders but 7. Through the rain-washed window, she saw Garrett leading the group, his face set in grim determination beneath the brim of his hat. Mrs. Hartwell. His voice carried despite the wind and rain. We need to talk. She moved away from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs. 7 men. Garrett hadn't been bluffing about having backing. I know you're in there, he called again. This doesn't have to be difficult. Mercy looked around the small cabin, searching for options. There was no back door, no other way out. The single window was too small to climb through even if she could manage it without being seen. She was trapped. 5 minutes. Garrett shouted. That's all I'm asking. 5 minutes of your time. Against her better judgment, she cracked the door open. Say what you came to say. Invite me in. This weather's not fit for man nor beast. I'm comfortable where I am. Garrett's laugh was cold as the rain. Fair enough. But you might want to reconsider when you hear what I have to say. I'm listening. My offer's changed. He had to shout to be heard over the storm. No longer $500. I'm prepared to go as high as $2,000. $2,000. It was a fortune, enough to buy a house in Denver, enough to live comfortably for years. But the size of the offer only confirmed what she already suspected. Her land was worth far more than even that generous sum. And if I refuse, she called back, then I'm afraid your run of bad luck will continue. His voice carried a note of false regret. Terrible thing, how accidents seem to follow you around. The threat was clear, and Mercy felt anger surge through her fear. Get off my land. Not your land anymore. Garrett replied cheerfully. Turns out there were some irregularities with your husband's original claim. Paperwork's been filed with the territorial government. Should be sorted out in a few weeks. The words hit her like a physical blow. Irregularities? Thomas had filed his claim properly. She was sure of it. But if Garrett had money and influence, if he could buy officials and forge documents, you're lying. Am I? Want to take that chance? Before she could respond, another sound cut through the storm. A single rider approaching fast. Through the rain, she saw Tobias materializing out of the gray like an avenging angel, his black stallion fighting the wind with every stride. He reined up 20 feet from Garrett's group, his hand resting casually on his gun. Problem here. Cousin. No problem at all. Garrett's voice remained cheerful, but Mercy caught the tension in his posture. Just discussing business with Mrs. Hartwell. Business can wait for better weather. Time's a luxury we don't have. Garrett gestured to his men, and Mercy noticed how they had spread out, creating a loose circle around the cabin. Railroads. Getting impatient. They want this settled. Then they can wait one more day. I'm afraid not. Garrett's mask of civility was beginning to slip. Mrs. Hartwell's had plenty of time to consider. It's time for a decision. Tobias dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. The lady will make her decision when she's ready. The lady doesn't have a choice. Garrett snapped. Her husband's claim was fraudulent. The land reverts to territorial control. Unless, of course, she accepts my generous offer. Fraudulent. How? Survey markers were moved. Boundaries incorrectly recorded. Happens all the time with these homestead claims. Mercy felt the ground shifting beneath her feet again. If Thomas's claim was invalid, if she had no legal right to the land, then all her choices disappeared. She would be left with nothing but Garrett's dubious generosity. Show me the paperwork, Tobias demanded. All in order. Filed with Territorial Judge Morrison this morning. Morrison. Mercy knew that name. He was Garrett's brother-in-law, a man who owed his position to Blackwood money and influence. If Morrison had signed the paperwork, it would be legal regardless of its accuracy. This is a setup, she called out from the cabin doorway. Careful about making accusations you can't prove. Garrett replied. Judge Morrison is an honorable man. Judge Morrison is a drunk and a fool. Tobias shot back. And everyone knows it. That's slander. But Garrett's protest lacked conviction. It's truth. And you know it. Tobias stepped closer to his cousin, and Mercy could feel the violence building between them like pressure before a lightning strike. This whole scheme reeks of your handiwork. Prove it. I intend to. Garrett's men shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons. The storm raged around them, turning the standoff into something primal and dangerous. Enough talk, Garrett barked. Mrs. Hartwell, you have 1 minute to decide. Accept my offer, or face the consequences of having no legal claim to this land. Mercy looked from Garrett to Tobias, feeling the weight of impossible choices. If she accepted Garrett's offer, she would be rewarding the man who had destroyed her home and threatened her life. If she refused, she might lose everything anyway through legal manipulation. But there was a third option, one that terrified her, almost as much as it tempted her. "Mr. Blackwood," she called out to Tobias. "Yes, your offer still stands." She saw him stiffen, understanding immediately what she was asking. "It does. Then I accept." The words hung in the air like thunder. Garrett's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, rage, calculation, before settling into cold fury. "Accept what?" he demanded. "Mr. Blackwood has asked me to marry him," Mercy said, her voice carrying clearly despite the storm. "I've decided to accept his proposal. Marriage." Garrett's laugh was ugly. "That's your solution? Marry my cousin. It's my decision to make. Not if you don't have legal claim to the land it isn't." But there was uncertainty in Garrett's voice. Now, marriage would complicate his plans considerably. The ladies made her choice. Tobias said firmly, "I suggest you respect it. And I suggest you remember that family loyalty goes both ways." Garrett's voice turned dangerous. "You're making a mistake, cousin. Wouldn't be my first. It might be your last." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Mercy realized that by accepting Tobias's proposal, she hadn't just saved herself. She had drawn him into mortal danger. "Think carefully about your next move, Garrett," Tobias warned. "Killing your own cousin for a piece of land? Even Judge Morrison might have trouble overlooking that." "Who said anything about killing?" Garrett's smile was cold as winter. "Accidents happen all the time out here. Storms are dangerous. Lightning strikes, flash floods, all sorts of natural disasters." As if summoned by his words, lightning split the sky directly overhead, and thunder crashed so close it seemed to shake the earth. In the brief, brilliant illumination, Mercy saw something that made her blood freeze. More riders approaching from the north, at least a dozen of them. "Expecting company?" Tobias asked, his hand moving to his gun. "Insurance," Garrett replied, "in case you decided to be unreasonable." The new riders formed a loose circle around the cabin, trapping both Mercy and Tobias. She counted 20 men total, overwhelming odds even for someone with Tobias's reputation. "Last chance," Garrett called out. "Both of you, walk away now, and nobody gets hurt." "And if we refuse?" Tobias asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Then we'll just have to hope the territorial government investigates this unfortunate accident thoroughly." Garrett's voice carried mock regret. "Terrible thing. How that lightning strike started a fire. By the time help arrived, there was nothing left but ashes. The plan was sickeningly clear. Burn the cabin with them inside, blame it on the storm, and claim the land through legal manipulation. It was the perfect crime. No witnesses, no evidence. Just another tragedy on the unforgiving frontier." "You're insane," Mercy said. "I'm practical," Garrett replied. "The railroad's paying $20,000 for this contract. I'm not letting sentiment stand in the way of that kind of money. $20,000. No wonder he was willing to kill for it." "There's just one problem with your plan," Tobias said conversationally. "What's that?" "You assume I came alone." As if summoned by his words, rifle shots cracked from the ridge above the cabin. Two of Garrett's men toppled from their saddles, and suddenly the odds didn't look quite so overwhelming. "Should have known you'd bring backup," Garrett snarled, drawing his gun. "Should have known you'd underestimate me," Tobias replied, his own weapon appearing in his hand with practiced speed. The valley erupted into chaos. Gunfire echoed off the canyon walls, mixing with thunder to create a symphony of violence. Mercy dropped to the floor as bullets shattered the cabin's single window, showering her with glass. Through the broken window, she watched Tobias take cover behind a fallen log, trading shots with 3 of Garrett's men. His backup, whoever they were, continued firing from the ridge, but they were outnumbered and taking casualties. "Mercy," Tobias shouted over the gunfire. "Stay down." She crawled to the fireplace, pressing herself against the stone chimney. A bullet splintered the door frame inches from her head, and she realized the cabin's thin walls offered no real protection. "Burn them out," she heard Garrett yell. "Just like we planned." Terror shot through her as she understood what he meant. They were going to set fire to the cabin while she was trapped inside. She would die the same way she had almost died 2 nights ago, in flames, helpless and alone. But this time, there would be no rescue. The first torch sailed through the broken window, landing on the wooden floor in a shower of sparks. Mercy scrambled away from it, but there was nowhere to go. The cabin was too small, the fire spreading too fast. Smoke began to fill the room, and she felt the terrible familiarity of it. The heat, the choking air, the growing certainty that she was going to die. But this time, anger mixed with her fear. She had survived too much, fought too hard, to let Garrett Blackwood burn her alive for the sake of his greed. She grabbed the coffee pot from the fireplace and doused the first flame, then used a blanket to smother a second torch that came flying through the window. But there were too many, and the men outside had endless ammunition. "Tobias!" she screamed, though she didn't know if he could hear her over the gunfire. Then the door exploded inward, and he was there, smoke-blackened, bleeding from a graze on his temple, but alive and determined. He grabbed her hand without a word and pulled her toward the back wall of the cabin. "What are you doing?" she gasped. "Improvising." He raised his gun and shot 3 times at the same spot in the wall, weakening the boards. Then he put his shoulder to the wood and drove through it, creating a hole just large enough for them to escape. They tumbled out into the storm, rolling down a small embankment as bullets whined overhead. The rain was so heavy it was like drowning in reverse, but it also provided cover, making them harder targets in the confusion. The horses. Tobias pointed to where his stallion waited, ground-tied and remarkably calm despite the chaos. They ran, slipping and sliding in the mud as gunfire erupted behind them. Mercy felt a bullet tug at her sleeve, heard another crack past her ear, but somehow they reached the horse alive. Tobias boosted her up onto the stallion's back, then swung up behind her. His arms came around her, solid and protective, and she felt a moment of impossible safety even as bullets whined around them. "Hold on," he shouted, and spurred the horse into a gallop. They rode hard through the storm, leaving the burning cabin and the gunfight behind them. But Mercy knew this was far from over. Garrett had 20,000 reasons to keep hunting them, and all the resources he needed to finish what he had started. As they crested a ridge and looked back, she saw the line shack collapse in a shower of sparks and flame. Another piece of her life reduced to ash and memory. But this time, she wasn't alone. This time, she had someone willing to stand with her against whatever came next, even if it killed them both. They rode through the storm for 2 hours, pushing hard through terrain that would have been treacherous in good weather and was downright deadly in the driving rain. Tobias guided his stallion with the skill of a man who knew every ridge and valley in the territory, following game trails and hidden passes that kept them ahead of pursuit. When they finally stopped, it was at a place Mercy had never seen. A hidden canyon where a natural spring fed a small grove of cottonwoods, their leaves still green despite the approaching winter. The canyon walls rose on 3 sides, creating a shelter from both wind and prying eyes. "What is this place?" Mercy asked as Tobias helped her down from the horse. "My father's secret," he replied, unsaddling the stallion with practiced efficiency. "He used to come here when he needed to think. Said it was the only place in the territory where a man could hear himself over the noise of living." The storm was passing, leaving behind the clean scent of rain-washed earth and the gentle sound of water running over stone. In the distance, thunder rumbled like a retreating army, and pale sunlight began to filter through the breaking clouds. "Are we safe here?" she asked. "For now. Garrett doesn't know about this place. Even if he did, there's only one way in, and it's easy to defend." Tobias finished with the horse and turned to face her. "But we can't stay here forever. What happens now? Now we decide what kind of partnership we're going to have." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. In the chaos of the gunfight, an escape, Mercy had accepted his proposal without really thinking about what it meant. Now, in the quiet of the hidden canyon, reality settled around her like a weight. "You could still change your mind," Tobias said quietly. "Say the word, and I'll take you to Denver. Give you enough money to start fresh somewhere Garrett can't reach you. And you, I'll deal with Garrett, one way or another." She studied his face, noting the determination there, the acceptance of violence as a necessary tool. "You'd kill him. If I had to. He's your cousin. He's also a murderer and a thief." Tobias's voice was flat, matter of fact. Some things matter more than blood. The pragmatic brutality of it should have frightened her. Instead, she found it oddly comforting. This was a man who understood the harsh realities of frontier life, who wouldn't let sentiment override survival. "What about the railroad contract?" she asked. "What about it? You want it?" $20,000 is a lot of money. Tobias was quiet for a long moment, studying the spring where water bubbled up from some deep, hidden source. "I used to think money was the most important thing. Security, success, the ability to protect what's mine. But watching that cabin burn with you inside." He shook his head. "Some things are worth more than money, such as, such as the knowledge that you're alive, that you're safe." He looked at her then, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "That you chose to trust me, even when you had every reason not to." The admission hung between them, more intimate than any declaration of love. Trust was a precious commodity on the frontier, earned through actions rather than words, and infinitely more valuable than passion. "I'm still afraid," she said quietly. "Of Garrett, of you, of this." She gestured between them. "Of what happens when practical arrangements turn into something more complicated. What if they do? Then someone gets hurt. Someone always gets hurt when hearts get involved." "Maybe," Tobias agreed. "Or maybe we're both too old and too careful to let our hearts run away with our good sense." But even as he said it, Mercy caught something in his expression, a softness, a warmth that hadn't been there before. And she realized with a start that it might already be too late for careful hearts. "The preacher in town," she said suddenly. "Reverend Phillips. Do you think he'd marry us today? Why wait? If we're going to do this thing, we might as well do it properly." Tobias smiled then, the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his face completely. "Are you proposing to me, Mrs. Hartwell?" "I'm accepting your proposal, Mr. Blackwood." "There's a difference." "Is there? Ask me again in a year." They rode into town as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Word of the gunfight had already reached the settlement, frontier. News traveled fast, especially when it involved the Blackwood family, and curious faces appeared in windows as they passed. Reverend Phillips was more than willing to perform the ceremony, though he insisted on a brief conversation about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of commitment. Mercy found herself liking the old minister's direct manner, his refusal to be intimidated by Tobias's wealth or the unusual circumstances of their courtship. "Marriage isn't just a legal contract," Phillips said, studying them both with shrewd eyes. "It's a covenant before God and man. You sure you're both ready for that?" "We're sure," Tobias said firmly. "Mrs. Hartwell." Mercy thought about the question seriously. Was she ready? She had loved Thomas with the passionate certainty of youth. But this was different, a choice made with full knowledge of its complexities and dangers. "I'm ready," she said. The ceremony was simple, conducted in the minister's small parlor with his wife and the blacksmith's family as witnesses. Mercy wore a borrowed dress that was too long and too loose, and Tobias still bore the scrapes and soot stains from their escape. But when he took her hand and spoke his vows, his voice was steady and sure. "I promise to stand with you against whatever comes," he said, his eyes holding hers. "To protect what's ours and to honor what's yours. To be your partner in all things. For as long as we both shall live." When it came her turn, Mercy found words she hadn't planned, drawn from some deep well of honesty she hadn't known existed. "I promise to trust you with my life and my heart," she said quietly. "To build something new from the ashes of what was lost. To choose hope over fear and tomorrow over yesterday." When Phillips pronounced them man and wife, Tobias kissed her with surprising gentleness, as if she were something precious and fragile. And for the first time since Thomas's death, Mercy felt the possibility of happiness stirring in her chest like a seed finding fertile ground. They spent their wedding night in the hotel above the general store, and Tobias was true to his word, respectful, patient, giving her space to adjust to the reality of sharing her life with another person. They talked until dawn about practical things, the ranch, the railroad, the legal challenges they would face. But underneath the logistics, something deeper was taking root. It took 3 weeks to untangle Garrett's legal machinations, but Tobias's money and connections proved stronger than his cousin's corruption. Judge Morrison was quietly transferred to a different territory, and the fraudulent paperwork was exposed for what it was. Garrett himself disappeared one night, along with several of his men, leaving behind debts, and angry creditors. "He'll be back," Tobias warned as they stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching the sun set over their combined lands. "Let him come," Mercy replied, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "This is our home now, our life. No regrets." She considered the question seriously. 3 months ago, she had been a lonely widow scraping out a marginal existence on a hardscrabble homestead. Now she was the wife of one of the territory's most successful ranchers, with resources and influence she had never dreamed of possessing. But more than that, she was part of something. A partnership that was growing into friendship, and friendship that was slowly, carefully, blooming into something that might eventually become love. "Ask me again in a year," she said, echoing her words from that first day in the hidden canyon. Tobias laughed, pulling her closer against the evening chill. "I plan to." 6 months later, when the railroad finally came through and they signed the contract that made them both wealthy beyond their wildest dreams, Mercy stood in the garden she had planted behind the ranch house and watched the sun rise over land that was truly theirs. The roses she had planted in memory of Thomas were blooming, hardy frontier varieties that could survive the harsh Wyoming winters. And beside them, new plantings stretched toward the light, their roots deep in soil that had been watered with tears and blood, and the stubborn hope that tomorrow could be better than yesterday. From the house came the sound of Tobias making coffee, humming an old song under his breath. In a few minutes, he would call her in for breakfast, and they would sit at their table and plan their day, their future, their life together. It wasn't the passionate romance of her youth, but it was something perhaps more precious, a love, built on trust and respect, strengthened by shared trials, and deepened by the daily choice to stand together against whatever the frontier might throw at them. The mountains stretched endlessly toward the horizon, painted gold by the rising sun. And Mercy Blackwood, for she was truly a Blackwood now, smiled at the promise they held. There would be other challenges, other storms to weather, but she would not face them alone, never alone again. Well now, ain't that a tale worth telling? If this story of fire and courage warmed your heart like a good cup of coffee on a cold morning, I'd be much obliged if you'd give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the wild frontier, where love blooms in the most unlikely places, and sometimes the best things in life come wrapped in smoke and flame. Comment below and let us know where you're watching from today, partner.